Hello and welcome to the Strength and Flexibility Summit presented by Nirvana Strength. I'm Ian McLeod, co-founder and head coach. We'll be speaking with some of the highest level coaches and practitioners in the world to get a better understanding of functional strength and active flexibility. You'll be taking away a wealth of knowledge on some of the most effective and safest ways to improve yourself and take your performance to the next level. On this session, we'll be speaking with Carl Paoli, author of Freestyle, a New York Times bestseller. He was born in the United States and grew up in Spain and became an elite gymnast. Trained and competed on the national circuit for more than 15 years and won a national gold medal for vault. Seen as a gymnastics guy for CrossFit and has helped many navigate the difficulties of gymnastics-based movements. Welcome, Carl.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, no problem, man. It's always great to chat with you, and you always have a very radiant energy about you that I'm very appreciative, and very appreciative of your time. So to kind of like really, I guess, delve deep already, when you think about like your gymnastics background relative to like gymnastics for CrossFit and gymnastics for just the normal person, how does the word gymnastics or what it means like change from situation to situation?
Yeah, it's a great question. For me, gymnastics was my schooling, so to speak. That was what I would consider my education. And my experience in gymnastics as a sport was that of discovering what one's body is capable of doing. And doing it alongside a set of rules and standards that come from the sport of artistic gymnastics and its evolution. And specifically in the men's lane of things. So being able to do all the 6 events, which were floor, pommel horse, the rings, vault, parallel bars, and high bar, and learning those. And I spent my whole childhood and early adulthood in this practice. And I guess if I look back at that experience, besides the act of discovering what one's body is capable of doing, one of the biggest takeaways was the concept of self-governance and being able to manage your own body, yourself, your recovery. And doing this, and this is the best part about gymnastics, was doing this with other people that are practicing the same thing. So it's an individual practice with a collective support. And the beauty of it is that it has carried over into everything else that I do as a coach and as just a member of society.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. I mean, I think there's 2 really good factors that you mentioned there. One, with regards to your capacity to govern yourself, right? And I think that takes on a lot of different things. Obviously, taking ownership of your progress, of your training, finding purpose in it. And that's something that we'll kind of delve a little bit deeper into. But I also think about the supportive environment that you're kind of in with regards to all the athletes. Was that something that you found to be also present in the CrossFit world? Because I think that's kind of one thing that people really love about CrossFit is that community aspect.
Yeah, that is a good point. When I first entered the world of CrossFit, I entered specifically through San Francisco CrossFit that was led by Kelly Starrett. And the first thing that he said when the class started was, if there's somebody here that you don't know, go ahead and shake their hand and introduce yourself. And I thought that was a very warm type of welcome to something that on the other end is going to be a grueling effort. So the community was everything. And then once I got deeper into the world of CrossFit and got to visit boxes, gyms around the world, this was part of the base of how the sport now, but the fitness program then was really practiced. And I would say yes, although CrossFit is slightly different in terms of the mindset that exists there, and the concept of intention behind the intensity practiced.
Yeah, I think one of the big things for sure that it brought to the market is that community aspect, and I think that's very important with regards to like finding sustainable practice. What with regards to intention that you're mentioning there at the end, like, can you talk a little bit more about what is the intention, and how do you feel like it's different in the CrossFit realm versus like what you experienced as an athlete?
Yeah, trying to keep this as succinct as I can. One of my first experiences in CrossFit, when I attended the CrossFit Level 1, which is the certification program that they have, I remember the first question they asked was, does anybody here know the definition of fitness? And there were 50 people in the room. And out of the 50 people, I'm assuming that 80–90% were coaches, trainers, and nobody had a good definition. And that's when the person who was giving the lecture said, in CrossFit, we defined fitness as increased work capacity across broad time and modal domains. A mouthful, but it was very specific. And if you broke it down, you could translate it into what the purpose of the program and practice of CrossFit was. And this, as the years went by, really started to resonate with me. Not the definition that CrossFit had, but having a definition or a defined, clear, and compelling way of describing one's intention in physical practice. And this is where I arrived at a place where, in thinking about fitness, I deconstructed the word ness. The suffix ness is a state or a quality. And to be fit is the act of being able to move towards a purpose. And this, as the essence of fitness, is important because if you look at it, it allows you to go in any direction that you need to go in. And that's the first question we must ask ourselves. What is it that we need physically, mentally, emotionally in our practice? And that question will determine how you approach a methodology or the practice itself. So yeah, that's what I mean by intention, and how I experienced that entering CrossFit and how it carried over.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, one of the big, like, I guess, takeaways I would think from that with regards to finding a purpose is that it's probably not exactly the same for every individual. And then also too is like, are we actually seeking out, a state of fitness that is something that is actually true to who we actually, like, what we actually want, versus like what's been kind of like thrown at us from media, from friends, and because the idea of like what is fit can be very different from culture to culture, from individual to individual. How do you go about like helping guide people through that process of figuring out what exactly is their own reason for doing what it is they do?
Yeah, that's also a very good question, and the answer is by using questions. It's very Socratic. It's asking people what they're excited about, what energizes them. It's asking people where they have found themselves in a place where they feel capable of performing or doing something. And this can be as simple as, I have energy to play with my kids, take care of my kids, make sure that the household is managed. For example, I ask them questions around the concept of exchange of value. Where is it that you add value in the way that you show up in your life? And ultimately, as you're adding value and doing all these things, what is it you believe that you or the rest of the world or a certain community needs more of? And with these different aspects, that which we love, that which we are good at, that which we do in exchange for value, and that which we believe the world needs more of, or those that we are serving need more of, we start to hone in on what our purpose is and what it is that we're actually doing with anything, whether it's our physical practice or our jobs or simply our relationships.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, obviously too, like part of that self-governance that they had mentioned before, and figuring out like what our values and beliefs are. It's quite obviously it's not a very fast process. And I think too, you probably get a lot of questions with regards to, getting either like, what's the fastest way I can achieve this goal? Or they're maybe looking for more of a black and white kind of answer as to what they should be doing, and almost like want you to like hold their hand and just take them there, versus I'm sure you probably at times can make things quite difficult for your clients. With regards to the questions that you ask them, right? It's like, because the idea is not to, because if you make it too easy, like what would be the problem with making it too easy for someone to figure out what they want to do or what they think they want to do?
Yeah. Let's start with a quote that I use to explain this, which is the best progression is the progression that allows me to ramp up the novice as fast as possible and use the same progression, the same methodology to challenge the most advanced athletes, the most advanced practitioners. What I'm trying to say through this quote that I basically paraphrased is that one needs to meet their clients, their students, where they're at. And the way that I like to think about it is I like to think about my students being in three different stages. They are in a child state, they are in a teenage state, or they're in an adult state. The child needs to be handheld, needs to be taught the steps 1, 2, 3, and constantly guided back to the program, so to speak. The teenager is the person who knows enough that they feel confident to venture out and practice on their own, do their own thing. And they're constantly seeking out everything but that which they have been taught. They're exploring. And the adult is the one that has done the exploration as a teenager and now is ready to come back to the beginner state, the child state, but with the heart of a collaborator, meaning open to collaborate with somebody else. This is when the teenager has met so much resistance or difficulty or hasn't been able to reach what they desire, and now they seek out expertise to work with. And this is where, as a coach, for me, in my questioning or in my relationship with them, I need to acknowledge in what state are they and how can I meet them there. And where the nuances come into play here is that one may be physically at an adult state, but emotionally at a child state. So the conversation and the approach becomes slightly different. And it's being able to see this and understand this and navigate this that allows you to weave a progression, or at least elicit, put one on a path towards a progression that's going to yield exactly meeting the needs and achieving the results that they desire.
So if we were to take what you're saying so far and just apply it to, you know, what you've been working on with regards to gymnastics and CrossFit athletes, and just some of your clients that are working on that physical component, because obviously you can kind of take all this stuff and apply it to almost any aspect of life. But with regards to strength, flexibility, skill training, what are some general, like, what are the basic weaknesses that you feel like people experience? You know, maybe like why do people have such a hard time with the idea of gymnastics as a whole?
Yeah, great question. If we use the theme of our conversation, let's say we're talking about strength. The way that I like to think about strength is as one's capacity to move, or in other words, one's capacity to get into different postures, positions. And a lot of times in gymnastics, what we're seeing is we're seeing an exaggeration of reality. For example, a handstand. One doesn't need to do a handstand with a perfect line to do a handstand. But if you want to perform a handstand in a perfect line, then you need to have access, the capacity to get into those positions.
Mm-hmm.
The simple understanding of this is what people struggle with the most. But once you get them to see that, then the solution to the problem is really easy, because we're going to work on some mobility. We're going to work on strengthening the new ranges of motion that you've created. And then we're going to take those new ranges of motion that we've strengthened, and then we're going to apply them to the outcome that you want, a handstand, for example. And this applies to every single movement out there. And once you get them there, now you start practicing, now you start stress testing, and now you start to really build a robust body of work around gymnastics or getting into certain positions. And this is really powerful.
Do you feel like most people go through that process?
No.
Well, I mean, so if we think about the general state of, I mean, like, just not only even talking about CrossFit, but the general idea of like what is, perceived as like fitness and how to go about making progress in the, I guess, in the masses. But what does real process or progress like look like from a physical health training perspective? Like, what does that feel like?
Yeah, for me, the way that I think about progress is when we see an improvement in our performance. And something that I've always said is true human performance is something that is measured by feel, meaning that it feels right in your head and your heart and your gut. This means that we have to have some kind of key performance indicators, and they have to be based off of an outcome that we're searching through our process. So, for example, if one is trying to learn how to do a handstand and dreams of wanting to achieve a one-arm handstand, which is something that I'm currently working on, then we must identify how are we going to measure this success, not only physically in our body, but also mentally and emotionally.
Mm.
And this is where one can now get into a process. And even though the process is ever adjusted, one can identify and see clearly that they're moving towards the goal.
Yeah, and I think for all the things that, like, obviously I think CrossFit brought to the realm, it I think for a big part, it really like re-energized the world really in regards to like getting back into fitness and getting into better physical health. I mean, we think about maybe how the situation is now this year. It's probably been quite restrictive for most people. When you don't have that community aspect or that environment that's very positive and supportive, like how can you adapt to the situation that we're kind of in? And then we're thinking about overcoming like particular obstacles, because those are inherently part of the process, right? How does like focusing on the purpose and the steps with regards to making progress, like how does that help with these obstacles that we're facing?
Yeah, that's also a really good question. And what it's bringing me back to is something that CrossFit did really well. Was CrossFit said, what is the most simple approach to eliciting results, physical results? And they called it intensity. They said, you're going to go fast, you're going to go hard, you're going to work like a champ, and you're going to do full ranges of motion. Very, very simple concepts.
Mm-hmm.
And they put object manipulation, meaning moving things, secondary to moving your body.
Mm.
So that was the first thing they really brought to the forefront. They said, this is about how you drive your body. It's not about how you are moving objects or building a certain aesthetic. And that's something that they did really well. And I think now, fast forward to, they've been around for a while, and they've definitely made a big splash and a massive impact. And what's been interesting to see for me, I love the concept of CrossFit becoming a thing, almost like a staple of, or a methodology of fitness. And then seeing somebody like Ido Portal who said, it's not about what CrossFit is doing, but it's about a little bit more of a nuanced approach to moving one's body. And here is the literacy of it. Here's the movement, the language. And seeing how these two worlds have actually now held space for practitioners who do all of the above to have something to anchor themselves on. And the common ground is that both sides, if there are sides, so it's all one, but both ends of the spectrum that we think we're seeing are saying the same thing. There is a method, there is a process. And if one can fall in love with that process, those steps, and return to them on a daily basis without the concern of the outcome, over time, you make change. And that's, I think, what we're dealing with right now, is that in a time like 2020, where maybe we don't have access to a community that's physical around us, or we don't have access to a gym, that one has really had to take it into their own hands and say, how am I going to lead myself to the place that I want to go to? And it's a very powerful question. And I think it's made a lot of people stronger. It's also revealed to other people who thought they were strong what they were missing, and been able to start to move in that direction. Yeah. And to me, that's exciting to think about. It's done it for me personally as well.
And I think, it's quite interesting, like the whole CrossFit, Ido Portal, the movement that's happening. And I think it's a very intelligent process, like everything that's kind of happening with regards to like calisthenics and gymnastics. And I think it's also quite funny too, where like gymnastics is seen as like a newer trend, where it's kind of probably been around longer than any of the other training modalities. Have you come across some basic principles in which you live by and incorporate into your own training? And what are maybe some differences that you find that what you're doing now relative to what you see in the general fitness industry?
I wish I could just say, here are 10 principles that I operate by, and if you do that, you're going to be well off too. I unfortunately don't have that, but I can tell you this: consistency is number one. When I show up daily, regardless of how much or how hard or how well I do it, I see change, I feel better. The second thing is, every day when I show up, I must choose to practice quality. And I need to define quality. I need to look for that. And sometimes it looks like aesthetics. Sometimes it looks like precision. Sometimes it looks like something else. I can give you an example. Some days I'm working on my hand balancing, and I just don't feel right. I am wobbly, and I'm not able to chase the physical quality, but I am able to think about maybe relaxing into a handstand, and thus feeling a little bit more stable, and that being the quality of the day. And then finally, operating with what one traditionally would consider a positive mental attitude. And the positive mental attitude is the attitude of seeing the value that exists in showing up and actually trying to pursue quality. And this value is something that appreciates over time. It's just like when you buy a property. Over time, you're hoping that that value appreciates. Same thing happens with one's practice when you show up consistently and you try to chase quality. And the quality, if you are uncertain of what that means to you, it's what you're curious about and what you get excited about. An example of this, when I was a kid watching gymnastics or watching my idols, Alexei Nemov, for example, was one of mine. If you've never seen him perform, just watch the 2000 Olympic Games in Sydney and just watch his style. When I saw that style, I'm like, yes, that's what I am going for. And I remember in '96 Atlanta, he was just on fire. And I said, I want to be like that guy. So in my practice, what I chased was looking like Alexei Nemov. And then eventually, through trying to look like one of my idols, I found myself. And I was like, whoa, when I see myself, I like that. That looks cool. How can I look for that position, that angle? And that fires me up. And I think that's something that I encourage everybody I work with to do for themselves.
And I think it's for sure like finding someone to find motivation from, inspiration from, you know, being able to mimic some of your movements like after someone. I think there's like definitely a lot of positives that can come from that process. But could you give an example of like what's the other side of that coin where, you know, you see a lot now where people are wanting to they just see something and they want to acquire like a high level movement or position, but they could maybe do it in maybe not a safe way, or they progress too fast, like maybe beyond their capacities. Like, and I think this would be really good to show like how your intention and your purpose in what you actually want to achieve can vastly differ, even if you're having the same motivation to some extent.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of layers to that question, but first and foremost, don't try to be somebody else. Just be yourself. You can use somebody else's way of doing things as a launching pad for your process. So that's number one. On the other hand, there are people that have amazing capabilities and they're able to progress really quickly. And the physical progression, I see it almost as the advancement of technology. If the technology advances too quickly, our capacity to keep up with how the technology works falls behind. And when we fall behind, what ends up happening is that the machine takes over. And when the machine takes over, automatically it divides us. And this is something that's happening around the world with social media, but it happens with our bodies too. It creates dissonance. We think we're capable of doing something because physically we're there, but mentally and emotionally, we just can't keep up. And when we can't keep up, we get to a point where we're constantly dissatisfied and what's the opposite of empowered? Disempowered? Disappointed.
Yeah.
And what we want to get to the point is we want to live in that state where our body is advancing and we're trying to keep up and we're feeling slightly dissatisfied but empowered because we know what our body is telling us, where it's going, and we are holding it with us and the progression with us so we can remain in some sense of control. And this is kind of going back to the different states that people are in. Usually it's the teenager that is very strong, has a boost of testosterone, can do the thing, can work really hard, has a lot of energy, and then is met with an injury or makes a few poor decisions, and over time that's compound, and now they are set back. Or if they're professional athletes, their careers end.
Yeah, it is quite unfortunate with regards to like how, you know, injuries have starting to play like such a big part of the training process. But in the general public, we kind of see as well, especially in the US, where, you know, the idea of hip replacements, you know, in your mid 40s is becoming like seen as normal. Or, you know, knees over toe, like Ben Patrick talks about like knee surgeries and knee replacements happening as well. So when you're thinking about like all these training modalities, and then people always looking for like, oh, what's the best system, you know, or what's the best thing to do? It seems also too like with regards to Ido Portal and CrossFit that there are some people who have kind of gone to extremes and almost create it as a sense, like a level of dogma is kind of involved with everything there, or even to an extent of it's like borderline like religion for some people. What are some kind of, you know, for all the good things that Ido and CrossFit has done, like where do you see maybe on the other side of the coin there, like what are some of the cons of those modalities, or even not just those, right? Like let's say any sense of dogma in the process of physical health.
Yeah, anytime we use a universal prescription and apply it to individuals, we're most likely going to fail. And we're going to end up in a place that is not serving a great majority of individuals. So the first thing one must do is to identify the best way of translating a universal prescription to an individual. And this is something that somebody who calls themselves a subject matter expert or a coach can begin to catalyze for their students, but it's the student that has to really identify with how that actually works. How do I apply this universal prescription to myself and my way of doing things? So that's number one. The other thing is the mindset of no pain, no gain, for example, has to or is changing. And the way that I talk about this is very simple. It's here's a rule of thumb for you. Move away from pain. It's that simple. When you move away from pain, this is what tends to happen. You find a different type of pain that is not pain, but rather discomfort. And it's in that discomfort where the solution to your problem is found. An example is if you've ever had a habit that is not serving you, let's say you drink too much, you eat too much sugar, whatever it may be. You drink too much coffee and you try to kick that habit, meaning you move away from what's causing you pain. You're going to get to a point where you're going to meet discomfort. You're going to have cravings at first. And then you're going to see things and it's going to remind you of the comfort that it brought you when you first had it. You're going to have forgotten about the pain that it was causing. It's in that discomfort where we see progress. And when it comes to physical movement, let's say, for example, if you're squatting and you have knee pain, as you're squatting, instead of trying to pound through the pain, what would happen if you move around the pain, you move away from the pain? In that practice, without being a knucklehead, but actually coming in with some care and curiosity and taking a cautious risk, you will start to notice new capabilities, new capacities. And this is where now you start to realize that our dogmatic approach or simplistic approach to trying to teach people how to move doesn't work. It doesn't work like that. And this is why we have to have these conversations.
So, and there's definitely, you know, with regards to like any kind of information, like, you know, a quick example would be like if we gave someone just a program template and we gave it to like 1,000 people, they would all kind of interpret it in different ways. You know, with what you're saying with regards to moving away from pain, you know, maybe I could take that away as like saying, oh, Carl said I should just compensate and do things that make me able to perform the movement, but I don't have to deal with any of the issues. Can you elaborate a little bit more on like the idea of using pain or using discomfort as an indicator of how you can progress better in the long term with regards to like mobility and maybe folks, maybe they're indicators of some underlying issues that people need to deal with.
Yeah. I'm going to try to keep this as simple and as clear as I can. And this is the first thing that's coming up for me. Let's say one is practicing pull-ups, and we're going to call the standard of the pull-up is going from a dead hang, arms straight, to chest touching the bar at the top of the pull-up. That's the standard. Okay, that's what we're going for. If we have an individual who, when performing a pull-up, happens to have some shoulder pain or elbow pain and can't go past 90 for whatever reason in their elbow flexion, are we just going to keep pounding through that, or are we going to do something else? Well, what I'm suggesting is, hey, instead of pounding through that, let's do something else. And this is where creating a regression is the actual progression. A very simple one would be, okay, let's do some assisted pull-ups. Can you move throughout the full range of motion pain-free? Yes. Now, can we explore a place where that movement is not just you doing it in space where there's no resistance, but where you actually have to put some effort behind it and you can enter a state of discomfort? That would be the most simple example that I can share with you. If you have a specific one that you would like, we can try to explore it together and see where it takes us.
Yeah, so I think, I mean, it's great to hear you say that the part with regards to like actually taking a step back or actually regressing the exercise could be massively, beneficial for an individual. And can be very progressive for them as well. And I think that applies to, let's say handstands and people's general relationship with the wall, right? Like they see the wall as like, it's there for like beginners, but as soon as I graduate away from the wall, I never need to use the wall again. But I think that, yeah, people's perception of like how they should go about their practice or what they see as progress is they never want to take a step back, or they never want to kind of like work on maybe the less like sexy movements, like mobility stuff, right? Because they just see all that stuff as like taking steps back. How do you go about like reframing that for people?
Well, let's use an example. Let's use gymnastics versus dance or ballet specifically. I did ballet for 3 years. It was the hardest thing I ever did. In gymnastics, there's a code. So you have a book, and this book tells you if you do this movement, this element, you will score these many points. And if you score X amount of points, you can win. You can stand on the podium. There is a progression towards it, right? And in ballet, yes, there are elements that you learn, but it's more of an artistic expression that is not scored. It's for interpretation. It's engineering versus art. Artistic gymnastics is more the engineering side, and then ballet is the art. In gymnastics, if you wanted to do a right leg or left leg split, okay, as long as you get your butt cheek and your back leg to the ground with straight legs and pointed toes, that counts. But you may get there without having square hips. You may be sideways like this, meaning this is a geeked out way of thinking about it, but your back leg or your trailing leg is lacking extension and internal rotation. Okay, that's what it's lacking. In gymnastics, I don't need to get my hips square in order to win or to make that count. If I do, what ends up happening is that it translates to something like ballet, artistic, and aesthetically more appealing. That being said, when you have that trained eye and you can see, oh, a square hip in a split is not just aesthetically better, but also biomechanically more advantageous, all of a sudden you return to the engineering side and you realize that the way that one has to practice is not just by the book or the standards that the book says, but rather in a way that is transferable, translatable, progressive. What am I talking about? Well, when one has a split with square hips, even if it's not all the way down, but it has that as the number one standard in approaching the movement itself, it translates into a better kick up to handstand. It translates into better tumbling, cartwheels, round-offs. It allows you to do it not just on the floor, but on the beam. All of these things carry over. And the person who is able to mechanically and artistically develop themselves are the ones that create the most transferable capabilities. And this is the conversation. It's helping people identify that a technique performed in a certain way, although it may be setting them further away from their goal that they had in their mind, in the long run is not just going to get them to the goal, but it's going to explode out into everything else. That is the ultimate standard, in my opinion. And that's where you capture people individually and you say, that's why pointing your toes makes sense. That's why a square hip and a split makes sense. That's why my feet in XY position while squatting translates into either powerlifting or weightlifting. And that's exciting.
Yeah, and I think it's quite interesting. I mean, even, through the couple examples that you gave, how, you find that sometimes something can be more anatomically like advantageous, but is significantly more difficult to actually get into that position. So then the perception is you find that people are actually performing more difficult movements with the perception that it's an easier movement. Let's say doing handstands with bent arms, you're forcing yourself to use more strength to maintain your position versus like if you were able to actually like stack all your joints, you'd actually be able to like find some relative ease and relaxing in it. How do you deal with like that part where it's like it's the perception of what I'm doing, it seems like it's easy, but it's easy for maybe the wrong reasons, when you're thinking about like breaking down movements and working people with that?
Yeah, examples always help. Being able to show people what they're currently doing versus how it translates always helps. An example that I always set for people at my seminars is I ask them to, we've been working on push-ups, for example, and I want to show them how a push-up translates into a handstand push-up. And what I do is I take them from a plank position or a push-up position, and I say, all right, please get into a downward dog. So basically just hips up, and you just create a little triangle. From that position, do me a favor and just put your head, the top of your head, flat on the ground. Most people, what they do is they take the path of least resistance and just go straight down. What ends up happening is they send their head through their arms. Basically at the bottom, what they're doing is they're putting their hands behind their head. And from there, I say, okay, now from that position, do me a favor and do a headstand. And then all of a sudden they're doing a headstand with their hands behind their head. And they're like, this doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
And this is where I say, do you remember in the push-up where I said, let's try to send our shoulders forward, keep your elbows on top of your wrists, and act as if the shoulder, the elbow, and the wrist was the same mechanical pattern that you're using in squatting, for example. And then all of a sudden the light bulbs start to go off. But here's where it gets even more exciting. It gets exciting when you say, you don't even have to think about the mechanics, because there are ways of setting up a movement pattern that is going to send you to a more transferable standard or motion. What do I mean by this? For example, anybody listening or watching right now, if you've never done this, try this. Do a regular push-up. And then once you've done the regular push-up, just flip your hands around so your fingers are pointing towards your toes. This is external rotation at the shoulder. if you get into this position and you try to perform a push-up, automatically the shoulders will travel forward, the elbow will remain on top of the wrist because you are at approximately end range of wrist extension. You are blocking the elbow from moving first. And when that happens, you start to use the power generator, or the joint that's closest to the midline, the shoulder in this case, and it sends you forward. So if I take this back to the downward dog and put your head on the ground, and now I ask people to flip their hands around, from there, nobody can take the path of least resistance and go straight down. They have to take the path of least resistance that takes them straight forward. It takes them into what we would consider a tripod, or head forward, shoulder forward, elbow on top of your wrist position. And this is where, when one understands the basics of anatomy, in this case, if you just think about your hands turning around like this, and then bringing your hands to your sides, you end up in an anatomical position. The applied anatomical position is the position that translates any movement pattern into not only an effective and efficient one, but also a transferable one. And this is something I talk about extensively in my book. I call it blocking movement for progression.
Yeah, I like that a lot. It's I definitely have to go ahead and try that after we finish here. But yeah, I think it is quite interesting, the idea of finding like proper positioning with regards to like your anatomy, and how does that translate over versus the path of least resistance, which is typically like the path that most people tend to go. I generally just always assume that whatever it is you're doing is probably not right, that you're probably compensating to some extent. So I really like that technique of the blocking movement, which is quite interesting. So when you think about, you know, the way that you look at movements now and how you break them down, and like just generally like even, and I think one thing important for everybody to understand too is like that a lot of what we're talking about, like you can kind of basically take the same steps and apply it to other parts of your life as well. How has your values and your principles and the way that you think about things, how has that changed from when you kind of first started in this fitness realm?
Yeah, when I first started in the fitness realm, I had no clue what I was doing, but I was capable enough that people believed I had something to say, you know. So let's just say I was a loose cannon, but I loved it back then because I was so naive that I dared to say anything. Yeah. And now I'm going to hold back a little bit because there's some things that I know have come up for me. There's something there, but it doesn't necessarily translate. So I'm a little bit more cautious now. So that would be one. That being said, I am very playful, and I can be pretty cavalier sometimes in the way that I express myself, because I know that if I can express myself that is a little bit over the line, I will be able to get a response from those I work with. And sometimes I'll say things, this maybe has nothing to do with movement, but I would say, I don't care about your problems. I have enough of my own. But I do care about what you intend to do about your problems. That's why I'm here.
Yeah.
This is a principle that I carry over into my own practice and working with other people. It's when you enter a place of discomfort and your mind starts to wander, and you start to have a pity party because you're starting to notice all the problems that you're trying to solve and how hard they are. It's in that moment you have to say, I don't care about the problems, but what I do care about is what I intend to do about my problems. Yeah. What does that look like? Well, at the most basic level, I have a plan, I have a process. Let me just stick to that. And once I start sticking to that, what ends up happening is that the emotion changes. So in terms of principles, they're very attached to the concept of emotional intelligence. And this being the ability to witness what you're emotionally experiencing, translate that into thoughts, take those thoughts and read them in a way that can bring you to a state where you're emotionally at peace and you can continue to move, because it always comes back to the showing up daily. It's the consistency. Anything that can get me there, that's the most basic principle.
And I think it, like, as you were talking, you know, and the idea of like, I don't care about your problems. There's like so many memories of my past coaches where we like talked about, because at the end of the day, it's like, everybody has like problems that they need to work on. And you, again, you don't really want to take it to a point where every day all you're doing is just like self-pity. Self-pity is like, what are the actions that you're actually going to take to actually deal with the issue? Because, you know, at some point, the always being down on yourself or always like just talking about your problems, like people just kind of get tired of it. And also too, as coaches, like we want to see our clients making progress. And like one of the things that I always think about with regards, let's say worrying about something, is very similar to like sitting in a rocking chair, right? Like just, it gives you something to do, but you don't go anywhere. You just stay in the same place all the time. So I definitely think, yeah, that idea of like focusing on like taking action and moving forward is really important. And I think it applies to everything that you're saying. Now, kind of like to take all that we've kind of discussed and, you know, bringing it to this idea of like strength and flexibility and programming and training and like that kind of stuff. Like, how would you best go about like kind of applying all of that? What's a better maybe mindset or framework to think about all this in?
Yeah. Well, let's try to keep it kind of high level, and then we can get nitty gritty if we need to set some examples. But the way that I think about it is strength is one's capacity to move.
Yeah.
A question that I always ask people is, how strong do you need to be to run a marathon? Well, strong enough. How strong do you need to be to squat 200 pounds? Well, strong enough, right? So there's no number that we're measuring, but rather an ability to get into certain positions under certain circumstances. That's the environment that we're working in. So strength is one's capacity to move. Now, what I talk about when I'm addressing strength is I'm talking about how are you mechanically moving, meaning what is happening at joint level, what's happening at your shoulders, your elbows, your wrists, your hips, your knees, your ankles, and so on. And I create a progression that is based off of a very simple framework, which I call the simple, complex, simple framework. In the beginning of that progression, everything starts simple. And when I say simple, I am referring to the joints. Let's say, for example, you're going to work on a push-up today. In your warm-up, you can take a joint like the shoulder, isolate it, and just move maybe your arm up and down. I mean, that's as simple as it gets. You can do some arm circles, big arm circles, small arm circles, depending on what you're doing. You're maybe exploring the edges or the end ranges of your capacity to move, or you're trying to warm up, activate, wake up the musculature around that joint. So that would be the simple side. Then you enter the complex aspect. This is where now you take the shoulder and the elbow and you start combining movements together. And that may be a push-up itself. And then finally, as you've arrived at a point where you're like, okay, now I've practiced, I've done my multi-joint movement pattern, now I get to the simple state again. But this time, instead of being in a place where I'm unloaded, where I'm warming up, now I'm going to stress the joint. I'm going to stress the system. So I may do some shoulder raises with straight arms with a dumbbell, for example. And I may do it into flexion or into abduction, which is just away from the body, or I may be doing it in adduction overhead. It totally depends on what you're working on. But that gives me a 3-part progression. 1, where there's a warm-up, I'm thinking about the joints. 2, where there's a practice and an effort that is a little bit more complex. That's the push-up itself. And then finally, I do some kind of accessory work that ties it all back together. And when we think about strength from a perspective of capacity to move, we're also addressing the concept of flexibility. Flexibility being the access to ranges of motion. And this is something that can be achieved passively under load, or doing different movement patterns in and out, or with some kind of manual therapy. And this is where it's important to see strength as a skill, and the skill being our ability to apply our strength. This is very important. The application of strength is what develops the skill, and the skill combined with the capacity to move is what creates what one would call mobility. And in mobility, what we see is we see a multi-layered process that elicits different techniques. It produces or expresses different techniques. For example, in CrossFit, you have a strict pull-up, you have a kipping pull-up. That kipping pull-up can be performed in different fashions. It can be either like a tucking kipping pull-up, a gymnastics kipping pull-up, a butterfly kipping pull-up. And regardless if you agree with something like an expression of a kipping pull-up, when you look at it from a mobility perspective, from a strength and flexibility perspective, you see that they're all part of a skill progression. And it's kind of like you have these doors. You can enter through various doors, but once you're inside, you have to cover all ranges. You have to do the strict pull-up, you have to do the kipping pull-up, because in the strict pull-up lie values that carry over, and in the kipping pull-up lie things that can carry over also to your strict. And this is where it gets really exciting, and that's what I personally call freestyle. It's a freestyle approach to movement, but it's always seeing the possibilities of the best biomechanical expression that one can achieve in this moment and in this state of their performance.
Yeah, it sounds pretty thorough. It's the idea that, you know, obviously we want to, for a lot of people, they're wanting to keep things quite simple, but it almost seems like the complex component, especially if you're new to the industry, whether it be a coach or you're starting your own, you know, training regimen, that it can get maybe too complex, like for what I want to achieve. Like, what are some basic ways to go about like building the initial awareness or building the initial capacity to actually move in the correct way?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so here's an example. Let's say you've never been able to do a push-up and you want to do a push-up. The first thing I encourage you to do is to try to do a push-up, okay? The moment you try to do a push-up, you may go down, no problem. But the moment it's time to get up, you're like, oh, I can't push myself up. Here's where I would ask you to adapt your body in any way you have to in that moment to get back up to where you started. That may look like arching your back and snaking your way up. That may look like you bending your knees, pushing your hips over your heels, and then getting back into the plank position. Whatever you did, that was a creative solution to your practice. Use that approach. Whatever your body told you to do in that moment, use that approach to develop the push-up. That would be like level one. And this is extremely important because the creative progression is the one that gives a practitioner the most amount of ownership. Because what are we saying? We're saying, I saw in a book that a push-up is done like this. I've seen people do push-ups and they do it like this. I try to do it like that and I cannot. The moment I do it my way and I'm successful at doing it my way, what I'm saying is there are more than one way of achieving a movement or completing a standard. Now, once I have that, this is where it's very important to not throw out the standard that has been achieved by others out the window. It's by identifying what is the next creative step to getting there. Maybe I need to do a scaled version of a push-up. Maybe I actually have no strength in my upper body and I need to do something with dumbbells, maybe some bench pressing. Maybe I've noticed that I have a very hard time maintaining a straight line from my head to my toes. My midline needs some work. Maybe I'm going to work on just holding a plank.
Yeah.
That's it. And all of those recipes are out there. But if you don't know what to look for because you haven't tried to do the thing yourself, you're never going to get the secret sauce.
Yeah. I think for sure, I mean, like giving people the confidence to be able to take those creative steps and actually taking ownership of their movement. But always, again, like looking, progressing towards the standard, I think is obviously something important, because I think sometimes people they might like find their own way of doing something, but then they'll just never progress to the standard, right? They'll just be like, oh, this is the easiest for me, so I'll just keep doing it like this. Yeah, I think that's definitely important to make sure you have like all that in your mindset or what you want to achieve, and not just like focusing on that one component. Cool. I think we're coming close up to our time. Had a fantastic chat, and really loved hearing all the knowledge and wisdom you had to share. Is there anything else that you want to leave the peoples with?
Yeah, thanks for having me. And all I can say is enjoy the ride and allow yourself to see as many ways of doing things. And if something doesn't sit well with you when you hear it or you see it or you feel it, just know that it's inside of you. And what is inside of you is part of the work that you need to do. There's no escaping this. So embrace it, love it. Work with it, seek out people who will support you, that can see that part of you, to allow you to be vulnerable or express the frustration or whatever emotions are coming up. And over time, you will continue to unfold. And it's your game, not our game. So play it wisely.
Yeah, awesome. And if people wanted to follow along with what you're working on, and maybe even take a look at your book, like what would be the best way of getting in contact or checking?
Yeah, you can find me online at freestyleconnection.com, or you can find me on any social media outlet at Carl Paoli. You can also email me if you ever want. You can also find my book on Amazon, is the easiest way to get it nowadays. It's usually not in stores unless it's a used bookstore or something. But yeah, that's where it is.
Cool. Awesome. Well, thank you again so much for your time, Carl. Always enjoy talking with you. For all of those like tuning into this session, I hope you were able to take away a lot of knowledge and wisdom that you can start applying to your own practice and your own journey. So until the next session, take care and stay strong.